Okay, hello and welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to do a good sort of Econ 101 coverage of gains from trade using opportunity cost and prices lying between comparative advantages. So for instance, two traders will benefit from trade when each specializes according to comparative advantage. That's our basis for mutually beneficial trade. And when the terms of trade involve prices lying between their respective opportunity costs. So it's got to be cheaper actually for them to obtain the good through trade from the other trader than to incur the opportunity cost of making it themselves, right? So opportunity cost measures sacrifice. You do one thing or another. So if you make one product, you give up the ability to make that product yourself or make the other product. And if that cost is relatively high, then you might be better off trading rather than incurring the cost making it yourself. So I've given us some time, some productivities to produce one unit for two traders, Nebraska and Vermont, making corn and maple syrup, which is what each state is respectively known for. So suppose it takes Nebraska 3 hours to make corn, 6 hours to make maple syrup. It takes Vermont 12 hours to make corn, or 2 hours to make maple syrup. So first thing, we can't make a production possibilities frontier from this. I would have to give you time, so that you'd be able to, with a given specified amount of time, say 24 hours, one day, you could determine how much outputs you could produce, and then you could make the production possibilities frontier. I'll mention that, but I won't put that in the video. The thing I want to say immediately is we can talk about opportunity cost, though. Nebraska can take 3 hours to make corn, or they can take those 3 hours towards maple syrup. And 3 hours is half of what it requires Nebraska to make one maple syrup. 12 hours is 6 times what it takes Vermont to make maple syrup. So you can start thinking about using time for one thing or another and then how far that's going to get us. Anyway, so let's specify actual times. Let's convert to outputs. So suppose in 24 hours, how much can we produce? Well, given 24 hours, Nebraska takes 3 hours to make a corn, so they can get 8 corn. With 24 hours, it takes Nebraska 6 hours to make maple syrup, so they can get 4 maple syrup. With 24 hours, Vermont can get 2 corn or 12 maple syrup. Okay, this is just taking 24, dividing it by each of these productivities to get us our outputs. Now you can make a production possibilities frontier. So for instance, corn would be on your horizontal, maple syrup on your vertical. So the intercept would be 8, 0 and 0, 4. This thing would have a slope of 1/2. Then being consistent, Vermont's intercept would be 2, 0 on the corn horizontal axis and 0, 12 on the maple syrup vertical axis that have a slope of 6, or minus 1/2 and minus 6 or whatever. Or you could reverse this and you could have corn on the vertical and maple syrup on the horizontal. You just have to be consistent. And then you'd see how those slopes of the production possibilities frontier are exactly the opportunity costs we'll find. Anyway, opportunity cost, Nebraska can produce 8 corn or 4 maple syrup. Boiling this down to like a 1 to whatever relationship, 8, let's just divide by 8. So 8 divided by 8 is 1, 4 divided by 8 is 1/2. So Nebraska could produce 8 corn or 4 syrup is the same as 1 corn or 1/2 syrup, which is the same as 1 syrup or 1 corn. Vermont can produce 2 corn or 12 syrup. So dividing by 12, they could produce 1 corn or 6 syrup. Or Vermont could produce 1 syrup or 1/6 corn. Why did I do this? Well, I like thinking in terms of like 1 corn and 1/2 syrup rather than like 8 corn and 4 syrup. But this is still going to give rise to the comparative advantage, give rise to the opportunity cost. So for comparative advantage, we're trying to determine who has the lowest opportunity cost of producing each good. So here are the opportunity costs. Nebraska's opportunity cost of 1 corn is 1/2 syrup. Vermont's opportunity cost of 1 corn is 6 syrup. Nebraska has a comparative advantage in corn. Nebraska's opportunity cost of producing 1 syrup is 2 corn. Vermont's opportunity cost of producing 1 syrup is 1/6 corn. So Vermont has the comparative advantage in syrup. What about absolute advantage? Well, it's whoever can produce the most in the same amount of time. So Nebraska can produce 8 corn, whereas Vermont can only produce 2 corn in a day. So Nebraska has the absolute advantage in corn. They can produce 4 syrup in a day, but Vermont can produce 12 syrup, so Vermont has the absolute advantage in syrup. And we can see that from the table as well. Absolute advantage can be held by both traders. Comparative advantage can only be held by one. Comparative advantage is what we base trade on. Absolute advantage is who can produce the most in a given amount of time or with a given amount of resources, who's the most efficient. And comparative advantage is who's got the lowest opportunity cost, who gives up the least to make that good. So again, Nebraska, it costs them 1/2 syrup to get a corn. Costs Vermont 6 syrup to get a corn. It costs Vermont to make 1 syrup, it costs them 1/6 corn, or it costs Nebraska 2 corn to make a syrup. So when will they trade? Well, when the prices lie in between. So if Vermont can give up less than 6 syrup to get a corn, they're happy. And if Nebraska can give up less than 2 corn to get a syrup, they're happy. So suppose we come up with a particular trade. Suppose Vermont gives up 3 syrup to Nebraska for 1 corn. That'll make both happy, because then Vermont would be giving up less than 6 syrup to get a corn if they're giving up 3, and Nebraska would be giving up less than 2 corn to get a syrup if they're giving up 1. So for 3 actually. So I say, when will they trade? If the price of corn in terms of syrup lies between their opportunity costs. So just phrased differently, I say it costs, if the price of 1 corn is less than 1/2 syrup, that makes Nebraska happy, or 1 syrup for 2 corn. Something that's more favorable than that will make Nebraska happy, such as 1 syrup. So more like 3 syrup for 1 corn would make Nebraska happy. 1 syrup for less than 1/6 corn makes Vermont happy. So like 1 corn for 6 syrup. So if they give up 3 syrup to get 1 corn, they'd be happy. 3 syrup to get a happy, yeah. So 1/2 corn or 1 syrup implies 1 corn for 3 syrup, and that's the trade I was thinking about. So Nebraska's opportunity cost was 1/2 syrup. Vermont's opportunity cost was 6 syrup. Both are benefiting at the trade of 1 corn for 3 syrup. So this is the proposed trade. Now there's infinitely many trades, right? The requirement was that Vermont is giving up less than 6 syrup per corn, and Nebraska is giving up less than 2 corn per syrup. So 1 corn for 3 syrup does it. Okay, so let's just make a trade. Let's just suppose each has just 24 hours available. Nebraska specializes in corn, they make 8. Vermont specializes in maple syrup, they make 12. Okay, at the terms of trade of 1 corn for 3 syrup, suppose Nebraska gives up 2 corn to Vermont for 6 syrup. Nebraska then ends up with 6 corn. They had 8 corn. They give up 2, and Vermont now gets 2 corn. They get 6 syrup back. So Vermont had initially made 12 syrup. They're going to give 6 to Nebraska. And so after the trade, after they specialize and then trade, Nebraska ends up with 6 corn and 6 syrup. Vermont ends up with 2 corn and 6 syrup. And then what I want to do is I want to show like this trade, this mutually beneficial trade, is going to allow both to consume something they couldn't possibly have produced given the time available. So let's just see what's happened. They had 24 hours available. Nebraska made 8 corn, gave 2 to Vermont. Vermont made 12 corn, or 12 syrup, gave 6 to Nebraska. And they both used 24 hours to make these outputs that they're now consuming. This consumption bundle, this one right here, if Nebraska tried to produce 6 corn and 6 syrup, how much time would it take them? Well, it would take them 6 corn times 3 hours per corn, that's 18 hours. And it would take them 6 syrup times 6 hours per syrup, that's 36 hours. This would require Nebraska 54 hours to be able to produce and consume this on their own. What about Vermont? 2 corn and 6 syrup. This would require Vermont 24 hours. They'd use their whole day just making corn. And then the 6 syrup is another 12 hours. It would take Vermont 36 hours to be able to consume this, to produce and consume this bundle, right? They don't have this time available. They only had 24 hours. Which shows like the beauty, the power of this specialization and then gain from trade. So I say to produce these bundles without trade, Nebraska would need 54 hours, Vermont would need 36 hours. With trade, each just needs 24 hours and then the willing trading partner. So economics is it's kind of cool. It boils down to something as beautiful as this, which is sort of mutually beneficial gains from trade. All right, this is apart from any sort of coercion or exploitation. both Nebraska and Vermont, both traders here, were better off as a result of this trade, substantially so. Now, yeah, Nebraska saved themselves a lot more time than did Vermont, and the kind of the rest of economics is deals with thinking about things like bargaining power and thinking about how these gains are ultimately split between traders. And there's a lot of really interesting questions there, a lot of interesting things to explore. But the foundation here is that there's mutually beneficial gains from trade available that actually make both better off. It wasn't zero sum. They both got better off, right? Okay.